I'd like to welcome members, officers, and members of the public watching online to this Licensing and Regulation Committee. Before the meeting starts, I would like to invite the committee member and scrutiny officer to explain how proceedings will work.
If a member wishes to speak, they should press the speak button located on their microphone unit. The microphone will light up green and the chair will be alerted to your request to speak. When the chair invites you to speak, we will make your microphone live, and at this point it will turn red. Details of how when requested to vote, voting will be via the yes, no, and abstain button on your microphone unit. Details of how members voted will be shown on screens around the room and on the YouTube live stream. Are there any questions before the meeting starts? No, I'll hand back to the chair then.
Apologies for absence. I have received apologies from Councillor Lisa Nash. Are there any further apologies from members? No. Okay. Chair's announcements. In accordance with council policy, this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be available both on the council's YouTube channel as well as on the council's Modcov site, alongside the documents from this meeting. Members are reminded to make declarations of interest before an item. The detailed reminder about this and speaking rights is set out under Chair's announcements on the agenda. For the purposes of clarification, in order to vote on an agenda item at this meeting, a member must be present for the entirety of the debate and consideration of that item. If a member leaves the room at any point of the item, they will not be able to vote. Notification of other business. There has been no notification of other business. Public participation. There have been no public participation. There have been no public participation requests received. Update on actions from meeting 14th of October 2024. I'm going to pass over to Steve Cobb to present.
Thank you, Chair. It doesn't seem that long ago that we was here before and you asked me lots of nice questions. So I thought the best way to start would be to update you on what we have done in response to the questions that you asked me. If after my update you believe one of your questions wasn't answered, then please ask me and I'll do my best to pick them up. But in no particular order, I did say that a fees costing exercise would be undertaken this year as part of our 3-year cycle of setting correct fees. That exercise is nearing completion and fees will be set from the 1st of April going forward by the exec member, Councillor Winstanley, and by Joe, our service director, based on full cost recovery, which is what I promised would happen. I updated you last meeting on the Cat Survival Trust in Coddicott, on the problems that were taking place there. And I have to admit, it was a bit doom and gloom at that stage. Fortunately, due to some excellent work by one of my team and the commitment by Mrs. Moore, the wife of Dr. Moore, who owned the premises, we've managed to rehome all bar 3 of the cats. So only 3 cats in the end were euthanized, and they were euthanized due to ill health. All of the other cats were rehomed and the premises is now closed. So that was a major win, and I think it's only fair that I put on record Mrs. Moore's contribution to that. And despite the fact that she won't like being named and shamed, Jasmine Jennings, our licensing team officer, who put in so much work to resolve that. The Women and Girls Safety Charter is now live in Hitchin. The take-up hasn't been as high as we would have liked, so our other Jasmine will be going around the premises chasing that up. But we have a number of premises signed up and we're looking to go live. Letchworth Baldock next, who don't have a pub watch, but we will be looking for some assistance from people that have got some influence in those towns. The HMO audit that was partway complete last time in October when I reported to you, there was a couple of outstanding actions. They have now been completed. So all of the recommendations from the audit have been taken on board and we now have a very good, I believe, system in place for HMO licensing. On that subject, we had a reasonably lengthy discussion about what we don't know in terms of HMO licensing and how many may be in the district, and members gave us some useful ways of looking into that. One of my other officers, who unfortunately left a couple of weeks ago, had worked with other departments in the council and found somewhere between 40 and 50 potential HMOs that we don't know about, that we will be visiting and looking into. We haven't started that yet due to being one officer down, but Councillor Winstanley, as our current exec member, has said that that's something that we need to prioritise. And as soon as I'm fully staffed, and I'm interviewing tomorrow, we will get back on to looking into that. So hopefully we will find some of these many unlicensed HMOs in the district and look to bring them up to standards in terms of housing as well. Scrap metal sites, I did say that we would make sure that they've all got an inspection prior to our next meeting. They have all been inspected, and we've introduced a program now of inspecting them once a year, unannounced. It was pleasing to see that the sites are trying to minimise the problems that we have in terms of fire. We were shown some CCTV from one of the site that has heat sensors on the CCTV, so it can potentially detect fires either before they start or when they've just started. And there's other measures that they're putting in place as well, making sure that the scrap stays within the walled areas, for example, not stacking it up too high so that fire can spread easily. We'll keep working with them until we can find a better solution as a council going forward. In terms of in-person licensing hearings, I know it's something the chair was very interested in. We did have an in-person hearing for a license review last month. It was very interesting. It set a new record for the longest hearing that we've had that has stood for a long time. That's by no means a criticism of the panel. Councillors Johnson, May, Allen and Willoughby, Stuart Willoughby, did a superb job in listening to a huge amount of evidence and reading a lot of evidence for a very, very challenging hearing. And it was good to see that the licence holders accepted the decision and didn't appeal, which I think is a compliment to the seriousness that you took in your decision making and the decision that you come back with, and particularly Councillor Johnson, the way you chaired to make sure everybody got to say what they wanted to say and that nobody could say that it wasn't a fair hearing. But you have set a new record. 10 a.m. till 8 p.m. So that's 10-hour licensing hearing. We do have another licensing hearing in person this Thursday. I'm very much hoping that we don't beat that 10 hours. I think, I don't know, Chair, if you want to ask any of the subcommittee that sat there, but I think given the range of people that were representing the licence holder in particular, I think that would have been a very difficult meeting to try and control in teams. And I think holding it in person was successful. But Chair, if you'd like.
Yeah, actually, I would be very interested in this feedback. Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for your comments, Steve. It's much appreciated. It was a team effort and it was a long day. I had dark hair when we started. No, to be honest, I've been on two others that were on Zoom and they went very well. But I agree with you. I think, I mean, we would have managed online, but I think that was probably the proof in the pudding, wasn't it, of needing to do a face-to-face one. So yeah, I think it was the right decision, wasn't it, really? Thank you.
I don't know if anyone else who was on that panel wanted to add anything. Councillor Willoughby.
No, I entirely agree with Councillor Johnson. It was very, very interesting. It did actually you weren't going to get bored with it because there was just so much stuff coming from all different kinds of directions. So it was a fascinating experience. Not one I necessarily want to do too often in the future, but not for that long anyway.
Thank you. Councillor Hoskins, were you? Oh,
I wasn't there, no, but sad man that I am, I watched it, and I couldn't believe when I went off to get a cup of tea and came back, and I thought, oh, I've obviously missed the result because it's. But I have to say, I was very impressed with the chairmanship. I thought nobody who was speaking could have complained that they didn't have their opinion or their voice heard, which is, I think, very important in the democratic processes. So, yeah, it was an education.
thank you. Councillor May.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd just like to echo the comments that have been made before. Also, I thought the chairing was extremely effective in a really complex case. I've not sat on a subcommittee before, and I was very impressed with the level of detail that the those on the panel actually went to consider all the factors, and actually not over restrict the activities. And that was one of the important things, was to get a balance between the needs of the people living around the site and the business setup of the applicant. So or the company that are running it. So no, I was very impressed as well. Very, very interesting day, if a bit long.
Thank you. Councillor Albert.
Thanks, Chair. So I mean, I didn't watch it live, but Keith Hoskins, I sadly also watched it on YouTube afterwards. Which did give me the opportunity to fast forward some sections, which possibly some colleagues might have liked to have done. But I think, yeah, I mean, again, just to really echo, I think it was extremely well chaired. Thanks to obviously officers and obviously councillor colleagues for their perseverance and on what was a tricky issue. But I think also that does mean, and I think it's right to say, whilst I think there is clearly a continuing place for having meetings on Teams and so on, but I think there is certainly a horses for courses type issue where we've got a complex hearing where I would agree with what Tim says, that I think there's times where there should be a face-to-face, and I definitely think that was that occasion. But thanks to everyone involved.
Councillor Brown.
So I'm not going to comment on that hearing, and I'm extremely glad I wasn't on the panel, and hoping that this Thursday will not be as long. But I just wanted to ask a question. So, Steve, you said they haven't gone to appeal. How long do they have to appeal? Because it's not that long ago, is it?
They have 21 days from the day that the decision's given, and they stayed and listened to the oral decision. So it's 21 days counting from then. Yeah. Good maths. Thank you. So yeah, just got a couple of more points to make, but yeah, Councillor May, I forgot that was your first hearing, but that's the sort of thing that we do with new councillors. We put them on long hearings like that. And I'm surprised that Councillor Albert didn't take the opportunity to say that the previous record was his first hearing that he sat on. So yeah, if you get asked to do your first hearing, be wary. Couple of further updates. I did give you some decision notices last time on taxi drivers where I had refused their application, and when we meet again in October, you'll get any new ones that have happened. But just to make you aware, there has been one further refusal since we last met, and there is likely to be a further refusal in the next couple of weeks as well. So we seem to be going through a period at the moment of refusing a number of drivers. But when we come on to discuss the taxi policy at a later agenda item, I'll explain why I think that is. And lastly, just by way of advance notice, the big policy that we will be looking to work on this year is the Licensing Act policy. So the policy that these hearings that subcommittees undertake is held under. That it's a statutory review every 5 years. We have to have a new policy in place by January of next year. It has to be adopted by full council, but it comes to this committee first to effectively look at what we want to do. I will be going out to consultation, hopefully end of May, June time, on a new policy. But Chair, as I haven't told everybody in advance, nobody's going to come up with some wonderful ideas now, I would imagine. But if you're content, I'm quite happy to receive emails from members of the subcommittee of ideas that they think should be in our policy to take it forward. I'm particularly keen to expand on our vision for licensing. We have an opportunity to say at the beginning of the policy how we see this type of licensing fitting in the community, and the subcommittee we aware, because I think you had, if I remember rightly, paragraph B10 of the policy thrust at you a number of times during the hearing. So we have the opportunity to either readopt that or build on it and set effectively some ground rules of how licensing not only regulates these businesses, but can play a part in developing the district, developing the daytime and nighttime economy, and tying in with other strategies that the council may have. So any ideas would be gratefully received. And that is my oral update, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give a slight update as well. As asked or instructed, I suppose, in the previous meeting, I have now written to the Secretary of State, the Deputy Prime Minister, about the licensing fees, the Licensing Act fees. So that letter, I have not yet received a response, but once I do, I will share with everyone on this committee. Just FYI. I'm going to go to questions from members in just a moment. So questions for Steve in just a moment. But quite keenly, I've had Councillor Tom Dyson write in a question. And we don't often have that. So I'm going to ask this question of Steve. And then I'll take further questions. I apologise because it's a bit of a longer question. I know Tom's watching tonight. That's not a criticism, Tom, but conciseness is often appreciated. Right. So it is entitled "Keeping Licenses Up to Date." The Council Statement of Licensing Policy is regularly updated with commendable revisions to improve its coverage of important aspects of the licensing objectives, and also to set out guidelines with regard to non-statutory requirements such as safeguarding women, protection of the natural environment, etc. Model conditions are listed so they can easily be incorporated into new licenses. However, permanent premises license will exist whose conditions have been superseded by revisions to policy or where conditions the policy now recommends were never originally included. With every revision to policy, the gap between what the licensing authority indicates to be good practice and the actual content of conditions in the operating schedules of existing licenses stands to grow wider. With regard to large-scale outdoor events, the licensing authority encourages the use of licenses with operating schedules that cover a number of events over the course of what could be many years. G 2.7 Statement of Licensing Policy 21 to 26. These operating schedules remain in place over the lifetime of the license, i.e. forever. What mechanism is in place to ensure such licenses are kept up to date so that they comply with the licensing authority's policies as they evolve over time? Should they be subject to regular review to ensure they continue to serve their purpose?
Thank you, Councillor Tyson. I understand the reason for asking the question, but the council's policy, much like the statutory guidance issued by the Secretary of State, is the policy and the guidance that you apply to an application in front of you at that time. There is no process to go back over licenses and say the policy has been updated, so let's have a look at those licenses again. I mean, I can't give you an exact figure, but we've got just under 500 licenses under the Licensing Act 2003. So it wouldn't be possible to go back and look at all of them, and the legislation doesn't allow for that. But what there is in the legislation, as Councillor Johnson's committee experienced, is there is a review process. Ultimately, irrespective of what the council's policy says and irrespective of what the statutory guidance says, the one defining factor in making a decision on a licence is, does it promote the licensing objectives? And so if at any time any licence is not promoting the licensing objectives in the view of another person or a responsible authority, that licence can be called in for review. Evidence can be considered at that time, and at the time of the review, the licensing policy that's in place at that time and the statutory guidance that's in place at that time will be the two documents that are applied to that process. I hope that answers the question.
I hope so. He's not here to tell us, but I think he can, if he would like a more full answer, then obviously I would advise that he can ask at full council for if there's anything else that we've missed there. Okay, in which case I'm now going to ask from any questions from the members here. Councillor Webby.
Following on from your answer there, if a license is, if a license holder seeks to revise their license, does that provide an opportunity to review the license in its entirety, or are you only allowed to look at the parts that are to change?
Good question. When you've got a license variation before a subcommittee, you can only consider the variation that's before you. You can't touch anything that's not affected by the variation. But what I should have said as well is that that variation will be considered again against the policy and the guidance in place at that time. But the general principle of a variation is you can't end up worse off than you were before you undertook that process.
Thank you. Are there any further questions for Steve? No? Okay. Thank you for the sheer amount of action you've taken since we last instructed you. It's been really appreciated.
Told you I'd do it.
In which case, we'll move on to item 6, which is the adoption of a sex establishment licensing policy. Steve Cobb to present.
Thank you, Chair. I'm hoping this won't be overly controversial, particularly given that we have no sex establishments in the district at the moment. And that's the reason that you don't have a consultation response in front of you, because we had no premises to consult with. But as with all policies, from time to time we have to revisit them to make sure that they are still fit for purpose, and this one hadn't been reviewed for somewhere around, certainly in excess of 5 years. And what I wanted to make sure was that if an operator did come to the district and wanted a sex establishment policy, that our policy was up to date. The other reason for reviewing it at this moment in time is, as you all know, the council was committed to White Ribbon, and one of the actions that the White Ribbon steering group looked at was, would it be appropriate to have a nil resolution for sex establishments? I won't go into too much detail because it was in the papers and I don't want to bore you, but we could as a council adopt a policy that says we will have no sex establishments in our district. I think that puts us on a difficult footing for two reasons. Firstly, if you take a policy stance that you're not going to do something, where is the right to a fair hearing for an applicant? It's better to have a robust policy and consider that application against a policy rather than say we're not even entertaining you in the first place. that would leave us open to challenge, because somebody could put in an application and say, yeah, I see what your policy says, but I've done all of this work that will mitigate your policy concerns. Why are you not listening to me? So I'm very wary of having a nil resolution policy for that reason. And probably the bigger reason is that when I went to licensing conference last year, we had a very good session on sex establishment policies. And we had a speaker there from a council who I don't want to name check because I didn't get their permission to name check them. And a member of the public. The member of the public was a very vociferous person that had campaigned against sex establishments in that district for a long time and had convinced the council to go down the route of a nil resolution policy. That caused many, many problems in that district, because if you license something and you have a robust policy, you can enforce that policy and you can make sure in particular that the performers are safe and get welfare concerns looked after and they're safe in the venue, going to the venue, leaving the venue, etc., etc. Under the legislation, there is an exemption. Activities that would normally require a sex establishment license can take place unlicensed 11 times a year on a single premises, as long as there is a gap of 1 month in between. That's an exemption built into the legislation, not something that we've decided. And what the problem that was being caused in that district was operators that couldn't get a license to provide the activities that they wanted to provide were picking random premises and having 11 events a year at that premises, then going to another and having 11 there. And effectively, there was a very active sex establishment provision in that district, all unlicensed, because it was all taking place under the exemption. And what the speaker said was her and her cohort that had actively campaigned against sex establishments and pushed for this nil resolution policy had now reversed their thinking, and their thought process was, if this activity is going to take place, let's get it taking place in licensed venues where sufficient safeguards are in place, where the council can visit and enforce, and the performers and attendees to a certain extent are safe. So the biggest thought process that we had in looking at this policy was, did we want to recommend to you tonight nil resolution policy? And we don't. And keeping up the name checking that I'm doing of various people tonight and thanking them for all the good work that they do that I take the credit for, I'd like to thank Georgina Chapman in policy, who contributed to writing this report tonight and the policy from a white ribbon perspective. Other than that, I've just expanded the policy to strengthen some of the conditions to make sure that performers are safe on the premises, introducing a couple more safeguards, minimum age for members of staff and other protections for performers. I think it's self-explanatory in its own right, other than whether or not you believe the not to have a nil resolution policy is the right way to go. And I think at that point, I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you, Steve. Are there any questions from the committee? Councillor Brown.
I just wanted to ask whether, so the licensing objectives under 1.3, you've got safeguarding children and vulnerable persons and ensuring performers are safe. There's no specific mention about trafficking. Would you consider that to be included under those? Because I think there's a very great danger that trafficked individuals could find themselves working in an establishment like this.
I totally agree. It was my intention that 131B was very loosely widened to encompass all those sorts of provisions. And later on in the policy, it does require the operator or the license holder to have a number of policies in place, and we would certainly be looking at trafficking, modern slavery as a potentially big concern in these premises, and so we would pick it up under that objective, unless of course the committee believed that it was sufficiently serious to add a further objective to highlight that.
Well, I just wondered if it could be included specifically under B, just put another clause in saying and a safeguarding from trafficking or some, I don't know. I just think the word trafficking should appear somewhere.
I agree with you, but also can we come to that once we've got the proposal and the seconder? But if you would like to think of some wording, or we obviously can instruct for the spirit of it to include it. But if you'd like to have a think, and we'll come back round to that on once it's proposed and seconded, because that's where we can add amendments, obviously. Sorry, my voice is slightly going there. Councillor, did you want to come back on that at all before we come to that?
I'll answer it all at the end when you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. And maybe this will be for later on, but I'll do it in the form of a question to Steve. But I think it's very interesting to hear about the white ribbon and the nil resolution, and I think you're right. We can manage it better having strong licensing criteria. What I would say in a question form, can we bring that front and centre and take it away from 2 point something and make it right at the start, so that we're basically nailing our colours and showing that, you know, wherever it appears, we're acknowledging the seriousness of that. But I think if we have it right at the start, that will show that, you know, we've considered that. However, we're going to control this rather than go for a nil resolution. I appreciate it's some might say, well, it's in there anyway, but I would really quite like it. Is it possible to put it up to the top? Is my question.
That's a really good point. I see what you're saying. It's sort of buried in the policy, and maybe section 1, the introduction, it is a really good point to nail our colours to the mask, and we can also perhaps at that point pick up Councillor Brown's point as well, to say that right at the very beginning, it's our belief that it's best to manage these premises so we can deal with issues of violence against women and girls, trafficking, modern slavery, and really highlight that at the beginning of the policy before we get into the main detail. I would happily do that, Chair, if that's the committee's wish.
I think it's a very good point. And again, if we can bring that forward as an amendment, I mean, even if you want to do it as one amendment that has both parts to it, like if someone wants to quickly pen something, or I'm sure we should hopefully be able to capture that, but if you can pen it, obviously, to get exact wording, that would be very helpful, I think, for officers. Yes, there are. Councillor May.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question on the nil resolution policy. Do you happen to know how many authorities have either currently have such a policy or had such a policy?
Unfortunately, I don't. I can only talk anecdotally from the room that I sat in, and that there's around about 350 councils that could set a policy, and there certainly wasn't 350 represented there, but there was nobody in that particular room that had a nil resolution policy after this particular council had moved away from it.
Are there any further questions for Steve? Okay. So I'm going to start off with the original recommendation. Obviously, I know amendments are coming. So the recommendation is that the committee be recommended to adopt the sex establishment licensing policy attached as Appendix A. Could I please have a proposer? Councillor Dennis.
Very, very happy to propose this, Chair, and I'm pleased that we're not taking the nil approach to sex establishments, as I think that, as we've identified through the consideration of White Ribbon, but also thinking about the Women's and Girls Safety Charter, having clear, strong regulations and licensing of establishments is how we protect women and girls and all those that work in these particular spaces. So I think that this is a really robust and excellent policy. I particularly welcome the changes which will protect performers and artists in these spaces that are contained in paragraph 21 of the relevant appendix, Appendix C, as well as the age limits being increased for staff that are working in the venue as well. I think it's very positive, and the team's done some great work on it.
Awesome. Thank you. And could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Hoskins. Are you, I assume you're reserving your right to speak? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Right. In which case we go to the debate, and Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to propose an amendment, and I'd just like to echo Councillor Dennis's comments. It's a very thorough policy, and it's great to see the safeguards for vulnerable women and children and all those vulnerable members of society strengthened. I'd like to propose that we move 2.8.8, the one about imbalancing the risks of a nil resolution policy, etc. We move that to 1.2.5, so it comes under the law, because it's relevant to that section, because it's saying it's not a legal requirement. So we put that in 1.2.5 exactly as it is. Then I think probably the best thing to do with, I'd like to add trafficking in. So maybe under A we could put safeguarding children, vulnerable and trafficked persons from harm, or something like that, unless you've got a better proposal. But we could put it into B, and then I'm looking for a seconder.
We specifically, I think, want to say modern slavery, because that's the
modern slavery.
That's
Okay, modern slavery
is more used for that. But you just a question is, would it make sense, Steve asked, if it was on 1.3.1 B, and ensuring
ensure that that performers receive appropriate working conditions and are protected from modern slavery? Is that possible, or did you have something better? I'm open to suggestions.
Obviously, it's the committee's discretion, but I think one way that you could cover off the point that you're raising is to leave the wording as it is, but instead of a full stop at the end of that section B, replace that with a comma and put in particular modern slavery, so that we're saying that it's actually an elevated concern of ours.
Okay, I'm happy to accept that. I need a seconder.
Councillor Johnson had indicated to speak first. Sorry, Councillor Mason.
Thanks. I mean, I will second that. But I was just wondering, what is the downside to just taking the whole chunk of 2.8.4 down to 2.8.8 up to the top, as opposed to just the 2.8.8? Because I mean, the wording for me and the message is very good and very clear. And I suppose the point I was making a little bit earlier is, let's just get it front and center at the start. I haven't, having said that, if people have got a different view, if you want it, a bit more concise, to just go to 2.8.8, but that was my only comment on it.
Absolutely agree. What has been suggested is that if we, with this amendment, delegate the authority to Steve Cobb as the licensing community safety manager, in conjunction with myself as chair, to make those final changes, and then obviously, but in the spirit of what you've said, if you're happy with that, then I'm seeing noddings. Yeah, Councillor
I'll
Dennis.
second that.
Thank you.
I won't speak again.
And then what I'm going to very quickly do, because obviously we have the choice to either go to a vote or, Councillor Dennis, would you be happy to accept those amendments as the original proposer?
Yes, Chair. I think it makes sense to amend the wording in 1.3b as suggested by Steve, and then I think what I'm hearing from Ruth and Tim in agreement is to take the whole white ribbon section and effectively move that up, potentially to sort of sit as either a revised a new 1.3 and then move everything down, or to my mind, actually, it might make sense to move the white ribbon stuff to where 1.4 exchange of information currently is, and then just bump bits down. But if that's going to be delegated to Steve to work out the technical, I'm more than happy to accept that as part of the substantive.
Okay, and Councillor Hoskins is the original seconder. Yeah, I see nodding. Thank you. In which case, we'll take that into the substantive item, and Steve and I will work on that, assuming that we vote for the substantive item. So, but before we go forward to a vote, do we have any further debate? I'm not seeing anything. So, in a moment we will go to the vote. But I just because some colleagues have arrived, I just want to remind that if a member leaves the room or was not in the room during the entirety of the consideration or debate of this vote, they will not be able to vote. No. I know, unfortunately, sorry. But it's fine. We'll see what the next item is. Could we please go to the voting?
That motion's carried.
Thank you very much. Right. In which case, we go on to item 7, which is the adoption of a taxi and private hire licensing policy. Steve Codd to present.
Thank you, Chair. There was a public consultation on this, and you may be wondering why there are so few responses to the consultation. And I'm sure Councillor Prendergast will know from the portfolio that he inherited. The taxi trade are normally quite a vociferous trade, but work that he did as portfolio holder and work that's being continued now by Councillor Willoughby as Councillor Willoughby. Winstanley. I'm not going to give you some credit for something you didn't do, although you was Sean's deputy. We have a very good working relationship with the trade now. A trade association was set up and we undertook a lot of negotiation with the trade association before we even went out to consultation. So I don't want you to worry that there isn't much of a response from the trade, so you don't know what the trade are actually thinking. I can assure you that if the trade had something to say and they were unhappy, you would have loads and loads and loads of responses. That said, that doesn't mean that it's this policy is automatically right. We had to review it because it hadn't been reviewed for a while, but most importantly, the government have issued 2 new documents in recent times since our current policy was adopted: the statutory taxi and private hire vehicle standards that we must have regard to, and the taxi and private hire licensing best practice guidance. Again, we must have regard to that, and what government are looking for us to do is publish a report to say that we have considered it and that we've adopted a policy bearing those documents in mind. So it's a process that we was part of the way through, and it's a process that we have continued with the policy that we're putting before you tonight. There are some important changes to the policy that I'm obviously recommending, and they fit very nicely with the council's current priorities. I believe you'd have seen from the policy we've done an awful lot of work on environmental considerations. there are a number of issues in the policy, or a number of items in the current policy where we had age limits. We said, for example, that we won't license a vehicle if it's over 5 years of age. That was a reasonably arbitrary figure that lots of councils used, and we, like many of them, adopted it. But that doesn't take into account the efficiency of the vehicle and the ability for that vehicle to potentially meet ultra low emission vehicle standards. So we've looked to remove as many age limits as possible and replace it with environmental considerations, and we're using the Euro standards. So I put the table in the policy for you in case you wasn't aware of that. We do have a number of Euro 4 vehicles that are particularly old. They meet our current standards, but their emission standards are not great, and I'd like to phase out Euro 4 vehicles. You'll see from the public, from the trade responses, some of the current Euro 4 owners are saying it's a bit sudden. I can't suddenly get rid of my Euro 4. But our policy has said for some time, I think from memory, it was introduced when Councillor Prendergast was exec member, that we was moving towards ULEV vehicles from 2028 anyway. So it's not a surprise for our trade. So I'd still like to remove Euro 4s. And if you was to adopt that policy tonight, we would write to all Euro 4 owners and say that when you look to renew this vehicle at your next renewal, you won't be able to. So that gives them time to make preparation so that they don't end up without a vehicle. Euro 6, I believe, is the way to go. It is the current standard. There's nothing that I could find to say that a Euro 7 standard was going to be adopted any time soon. So I think Euro 6 is the right way forward, and it's what councils are tending to work to now. In terms of other things that we're looking to do, as we've got such a good working relationship with the taxi trade now, we're looking to see what works better for them. We've got our licensing objectives. We have to make sure that the public are safe, but we asked them specifically, is there anything in terms of red tape or things that you think are making your job particularly difficult to get your vehicle licensed? And we've taken on board some of those things. Insurance write-offs, for example, we have a current policy that says if a vehicle has been written off for insurance purposes, you cannot license it as a taxi. I think that's particularly onerous, given that your insurance companies, I apologise if anybody works in insurance, but insurance companies tend to write vehicles off now for no apparent reason because it's easier for them, and they can be repaired, particularly if it's non-structural repairs. So we're recommending that our policies change to say that if you're a category N or a category S, which is non-structural or repairable structural damage, as long as you can demonstrate that your vehicle is roadworthy, we will license it, because we were finding that drivers were involved in an accident. Quite often it wasn't their fault. The insurers wrote off their vehicle, and so they couldn't license it anymore, but it was invariably written off under Section N, and I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't be licensing the category N write-off, because it's not unsafe. Vehicle testing is a big change to our policy. We give vehicles annual licenses currently up until the age of 7 years, and then they have to be tested every 6 months. So that's a test here at the council, which is a non-structural test, but they also have to have an MOT. So what we're effectively saying is once a taxi reaches 7 years of age, it has to have 2 MOTs a year. Vehicle manufacturers moved on now. We are testing loads of vehicles on a 6-monthly basis. They're all presenting MOTs with no failures, no advisories. They're meeting our standards, and we believe that it's unnecessary to have 6-monthly testing at 7 years of age, and we're proposing to extend that to 10 years of age, because I think 10 years is a reasonably fair standard for a vehicle, particularly as this is the driver's main income. They look after these vehicles much better than I'll look after my vehicle, because if they don't and we take it off of the road, they can't work. So they do look after their vehicles really well, and I think 6 monthly testing at 10 years is fair. Equally, initial MOTs. You and I, if we're fortunate enough to buy a new vehicle, it doesn't need an MOT until it reaches 3 years of age. We make our taxis provide an MOT on year 1, year 2, and year 3. Why? It's a roadworthy vehicle. Why should we put that extra barrier or that extra cost on the taxi trade that we don't have to put our vehicles on the road? So again, we're recommending that we bring our MOT requirements in line with everybody else that's on the road, and that a vehicle doesn't have to provide an MOT until it's 3 years of age. A little bit of tidying up in the policy. A lot of it is tidying up. This committee mandated some time ago at the last policy that vehicles have to have credit cards or debit cards, mainly because that policy came in around about the time of COVID and people weren't carrying money. The policy drafting wasn't great. I have to put my hands up on that one. And whilst we mandated credit and debit cards, we didn't actually put a requirement in the policy that they had to take a payment by credit card, and that they couldn't charge additional fees. So what we've had lots of examples of drivers saying, I'm not taking a credit card payment unless it's at least a £5 because it's not worth my while, or my bank charges me whatever it is, 40p, 45p for a transaction, so you've got to pay that as well. So we've just clarified in the policy that you have to take a credit card or debit card if that's what the passenger wants, and you can't pass on any additional charges, and you can't say that there is a minimum charge for a credit card payment. Driver medicals. We've always mandated that a driver has to get a medical from their own GP. That's proving particularly impractical to new applicants for taxi licenses. I'm sure you've all found, and this is certainly a non-political statement, that you can't get a doctor's appointment if there's something wrong with you. So getting a doctor's appointment when you just want them to fill in a form is virtually impossible. And we've had lots of potential applicants to be taxi drivers waiting months to get a doctor's appointment to fulfill the medical requirements. There are a lot of companies out there now that were set up initially for HGV drivers to undertake the D4 medical. They are all GPs that are on the General Medical Council register. So we've now opened up our medicals to say anybody on the GMC register can do a medical, provided the GP signs to say that they've had access to that applicant's full medical history. And I think that will remove some of the blockage of getting new drivers into the system. I should have said I'm not going to go through everything in detail. I'm just trying to pick out the things that I think are the main importance. The Institute of Licensing, I mentioned them earlier because I go to the annual conference. They have published what they call their suitability guidance, because they're trying to get a standard across the country where all licensing authorities set a similar standard. It's no secret to know that a driver can go to one authority, get refused on the basis of his or her convictions, and go to a neighbouring authority and get a licence because they don't have such high standards. So what I've looked to do in this policy is make sure that our policy at least agrees with the suitability guidance that the Institute have put forward. But if our current policy is stricter, shall we say, than the suitability guidance, I've kept our original policy, because I don't think we can play around with making sure that our members of the public are safe when they get in taxi cars. the rest is just general updating for safeguarding, bringing our procedures up to date, allowing the drivers to benefit from some of the smarter ways of working that we've found. And on that basis, I think, Chair, I'll leave it at that and see if there are any questions. But that's the policy I would like to propose this evening.
Thank you, Steve. Are there any questions for Steve? Oh, yeah. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Steve. Two questions really. Well, the first one, there's a follow-up coming, but how much does it cost roughly for this extra testing? And you said they're done at the council, and there's a reason for asking it. But roughly, how much are we talking about to do this 6-monthly test?
It would be the cost of the MOT, whichever garage they go to, but to come to the council to have the non-structural test that we do, that's in the region of £30.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I thought it might be quite a bit more than that. What I was going to suggest, then, is there any potential to, because I take your point entirely, with the improvement in manufacturing standards, 7 years has sort of gone by the board. Why stop at 10 would be my next question. Why not, extend it to, say, 12, or do you think that's too far? I've got to say the main driver for that those additional years would be the cost saving. But if we're only talking £30 or something, then it doesn't worry me at all. But is there any potential to extend it even further, do you think, to something like 12?
Yeah, I don't think that would be unreasonable. When this policy was brought in a long time ago, car standards certainly weren't as they are now, and 7 years seemed appropriate. But yeah, certainly our experience on 6-monthly testing is nobody's failing it. 10 years seemed to be a good compromise between moving towards some advantage to the trade, but not moving too far that the public would feel concerned that we wasn't taking our responsibilities seriously. I certainly wouldn't be adverse to 12 years. I don't think it would pose any additional risk, because we do, as we're out and about in the district, we walk up and down taxi ranks. We are undertaking some of the visual tests that we would undertake anyway when we call them in here.
Did you want to come back on that, Councillor?
Just briefly, yeah. And yeah, I mean, that's great to hear, really. I mean, I'd leave that to your experience, really. I mean, they are additional tests, aren't they? They've got existing MOTs, so it's not like nothing's being checked. But yeah, 12 would be good for me, but it's not an issue if it's 10. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mason.
Thanks, Chair. 2 points. Trying to find which one it is. On the not having to have an MOT for the first 3 years, what sort of mileage are these cars generally doing a year?
Ooh, I don't have that information to hand.
Well, I mean, my question being is that not having to an MOT for 3 years, I wonder if there should be a caveat about mileage as well, because if the mileage is I'm guessing these cars do probably more mileage in a year than most of us would do in 3 years. It's just
That's certainly the case with some of them. Our trade is quite a diverse trade. We've got a number of drivers where it's their only income and they work full time at it. We've got others that do it part time in addition to other jobs as well. So in terms of an additional safeguard, if you was to support the no MOT for 3 years, but set a caveat that if you reach a certain mileage, then that would seem a sensible compromise to that.
I have a second question. This one's even more niche. I'm really sorry. 8.28. It says the proposed. You talked about slightly loosening restriction on not having to go to a GP, which does make sense. 8.28 says the proposed policy has been amended to allow a medical to be undertaken by any general medical council registered medical practitioner, providing they have access to the applicant's full medical history. I've got a slight issue with that, which is there's a slight issue, is the GMC are now registering medical associate professionals, MAPs, who are not a doctor. And I'm just wondering whether that's tight enough, whether that should say doctor in there. You just might want to look at it. It's a very fluid situation at the moment. But that, to me, I'm trying to work out, because presumably you want them to see a GP and a doctor. And I'm just not 100% certain that that would now cover it.
Yeah, I see what you, the term medical practitioner, yeah, is perhaps too loose. Every time we get a medical, we check the doctor's number against the GMC GP register. So perhaps our policy should say medical practitioner registered on the GMC GP register. Would that allay your concerns?
Registered as a doctor.
Yeah.
Would cover it, because they might not, presumably they might not necessarily be a GP. They could be, I don't know.
Yeah, it's having that sufficient knowledge to fully understand the standards.
Sorry, but I'm just trying to, because I can see you trying to keep it really tight, and I think the policy of loosening it slightly is a good one, but I don't want to see it be loosened too much, because I might be in that car.
No, that's a fair point. We need to ensure that whoever signs that form to say that they meet the D4 standards understand those standards and can apply them correctly. So, Chair, with your discretion, I'll look at some wording, maybe in consultation with you again, to allay Councillor Mason's concerns.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to do that as a amendment to the recommendations here. So, Councillor Mason, could I ask that you quickly jot something down? Even if it's just obviously delegating the authority as we did before, obviously just so we get the exact idea of what we want to do.
My suggestion, I don't think if this covers what Steve wants, I would have just said undertaken by a general medical council registered doctor. But I don't know if that, Steve would have to check that covers his legal.
So I also meant for the previous one that would be an amendment as well. Your previous, and we'll do it in the debate. Thank you, Councillor Prendergast.
Thanks, Chair. Pardon my ignorance, but with the MOT testing, the requirement after 10 years, although we might extend that, 6 monthly, is that on top of the MOT they would ordinarily have outside of it?
Yeah, instead of having one MOT a year as a normal vehicle, they would have to have a second one as well at 6 months.
What's the rationale for that?
The rationale behind that is because they do such high mileage that we need to undertake a proper mechanical test to make sure that the vehicle is safe. I know ordinary members of the public don't have to do that, but most members of the public don't do the sort of mileage that taxis do. So it's something that we've done as a, I don't like to use the word safeguard because it's too connected to safeguarding, but as a safeguard to members of the public so that they understand that we do undertake regular testings on these vehicles to make sure that they are roadworthy.
Okay. And in for consistency and for its importance, perhaps we should move the 3.10 with the safeguarding up the policy like we did with the last one, because at least with taxis we actually have them in the district, and it's arguably even more important because taxi drivers are like to come across scenarios where that would be very pertinent to their role.
I would very happily do that as a member of the Institute of Licensing. We as an institute believe that safeguarding should be a licensing objective in all licensing policies, but sadly legislation doesn't allow that. So anything that we can do to promote the good work that this council does on safeguarding, I'm more than happy to promote that.
Right.
I'll suggest then to you, Sean, that again, please write that and have that ready for the debate to bring an amendment forward for that one. Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering on 3.93, should we also have any drug offences point in there, or would that come under any motoring offence if it was in relation to?
Ooh. I've been caught out. Thank you, Councillor Allen. That is a very valid point, and that's an omission on my part.
You're welcome.
I assume that we're also getting to speak. We'd like that as an amendment as well. Are there any further questions before we move to a slew of amendments to the recommendations? Councillor Mason again.
It just occurred to me before I ask my last question, I probably should declare that I'm employed by the British Medical Association. I don't believe there's a conflict of interest. It just gives me a certain more knowledge of this subject than the average layperson. It is declared in my on my standard declaration of interest, but
I don't believe that would count as a conflict of interest. It's actually just good knowledge.
Yes.
So, thank you. Councillor Brown.
My questions are all on things that are in the current policy, not the things in red. Is it still worth me asking them? It's just I'm a bit confused. So there's quite a few references to wheelchair accessibility, and I don't know whether I've read it right, but it says something about no new licenses will be issued without wheelchair accessibility. Is that correct, or have I got something wrong? Under 2.7.4, and I wonder how practical that really is. Oh, there's a London type taxi or a suitable 2.7.4 and 2.7.5. Is that why we're not registering any new taxis? Or not very many?
I don't think it is. To reel it back a little bit, we've got a duty as a council under the Equality Act to make sure that in our transport provision that we license that there's sufficient accessibility for everybody. Our policy used to say, the policy prior to this policy used to say that no new vehicles at any time unless they're wheelchair accessible. What we changed that to, and what's in the current policy, is that we won't license any new vehicles that are not wheelchair accessible unless we have 10% of our fleet that is wheelchair accessible.
Yeah.
So what happens periodically, because some cars go, some take, and that's a very fluid percentage. Well, we monitor it, and once we realise that we've met that 10%, we calculate how many new vehicles that we could take that are non-wheelchair accessible that won't take us back down below 10%.
Okay, so we're at around the 10% already.
So we open it up. So for example, on private hire vehicles last year, we'd exceeded our 10% and we was able to take on somewhere between 15 and 20 new private hires that weren't wheelchair accessible, and we were still able to maintain our percentage. So if you, for example, came along at this moment in time and said you'd like to license a vehicle for the first time, it would have to be wheelchair accessible. But once we reach that 10%, we would contact you and say we could now take your vehicle that is not wheelchair accessible.
Okay, I've understood it then. So I was thinking maybe we were nowhere near that, and that's why we weren't registering anything, but it's not the case. And just for the record, I welcome that we're encouraging accessibility, because obviously a lot of people that use taxis are going to be disabled and need wheelchairs. So just for the record, I thought it's important to say that. Yes. Another one that I had a question about was the volunteer sector transport under 2.43. How does that work in practice? Because certainly in Royston, we have a organisation called Royston District Community Transport where volunteers use their own cars, and they are paid a mileage rate. So I just wondered how that's actually applied in practice. Would they be required to have a license for that?
That's a really tricky area. Government issued some guidance on that, and it's not particularly helpful guidance. But the guidance says that you don't need a license when you're undertaking voluntary transport duties, providing you're not making a financial gain out of it. So if you just get paid a mileage fee to cover your expenses, you wouldn't fall within the licensing regime. If you was getting your mileage plus you was getting a day rate, say for example, you would then fall within the licensing regime.
Sorry, I've got one more question. I'm very reassured to hear that. Also, because I live in Royston, 2.35 talks about working outside of the district. Obviously, Royston is like, I live 2 miles from Cambridgeshire, and I imagine a lot of taxis registered in Royston would do trips to Cambridge, trips to Stansted Airport, and so forth. And I just wonder again how this works out in practice. Because if you live in Royston and want to run a taxi from your home base in Royston, you wouldn't want to register in Cambridgeshire, and yet you might be doing a lot of your mileage outside of North Herts. How does that work in practice?
That's called cross-border hiring, and it's probably the biggest issue that we've got in taxi and private hire work across the country, I suppose. It's different for taxis and different for private hire vehicles. So to be a taxi, you can only apply for hire. So make yourself available either by parking on a rank or driving around the streets and being flagged down in the district in which you are licensed. So if you're licensed as a taxi in Royston and you want to work in Cambridge, you would have to do it off of phone calls, and you would have to drive into Cambridge in response to a phone call. You couldn't drive around Cambridge looking for work. It's different for private hire vehicles, because private hire vehicles have to work for a private hire operator, and that private hire operator can take bookings from anywhere in the country, provided that they send a vehicle and a driver that are licensed with the same district that their operator license is in. So for example, if you wanted to go into Cambridge and you phoned up a Cambridge private hire operator, they would have to send you a Cambridge licensed vehicle with a Cambridge licensed driver, or they could subcontract it to a Royston private hire operator, and then they could send you a Royston vehicle with a Royston driver. That causes us a lot of issues, because currently we have no enforcement powers to enforce against vehicles that we don't license. So if we had Cambridge coming into Royston, for example, we would have to get Cambridge to come and enforce. And in the same way, I was trying to avoid saying this word, but Uber, our taxi trade, I'm not happy with the amount of Uber work that goes on in the district, and that we don't enforce against it. But Uber are a private hire operator licensed by Transport for London, so only Transport for London can come into our district and enforce against Uber drivers.
Thank you. Okay, are there any sorry, are there any further questions for Steve? Okay. In which case, I'm going to read out the current recommendations as they stand. That the committee be recommended to A, consider the responses to the public consultation, and B, adopt the revised policy attached as Appendix A, subject to any amendments proposed by the committee. Could I have a proposer for the original recommendations, please? Ruth.
I'm happy to propose that. I welcome the additional safeguards in 3.10, and I believe there's going to be an amendment to bring them further forward, which I also welcome. So thank you.
Thank you. And could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Prendergast.
Happy to second, Chair, and reserve the right.
Okay, in which case we move to the debate. Councillor Allen.
My light was on to second.
Oh, sorry. Just. Okay. In which case we move to the debate, and I believe there are some amendments. So, Councillor Mason.
So I'm looking at 3.5.2 Roman numerals 2. Looking at the actual wording of the thing, there's something else. That point 2 says to be completed by the applicant's GP. That bit's fine. A member of the applicant's GP surgery, or a general medical council registered medical practitioner having access. So I'm already slightly worried by general medical council registered medical practitioner. I'm also slightly concerned as to what the meaning of a member of the GP's surgery is. I'm not aware of any term that would cover. Does it mean, my guess is the intention is to be another GP partner, but these days, sorry to be tech, but I mean, it's a good chance another doctor in the practice won't be a GP partner. They might well be an employed GP, or it could be a nurse, or increasingly there are other medical professionals who could be there. I'm not sure what the best wording is. I just think we need to be absolutely clear what it is you want. If you want it to be their GP or another doctor, I think it needs to say that. Because I think at the moment, I'm just not convinced that we could have a very expensive lawyer sat in front of someone at some point saying, oh no, it says a medical thing. It was, you could say be completed by the applicant's GP or another general medical council registered doctor having access to full medical records. I think that would be tight, but you would have to get it up. My advice would be that would need to be checked before it kind of goes into statute. I guess it's just trying to understand what it's supposed to say, and I've got absolutely no idea where that member of the GP of the GP surgery comes from. And I just think possibly medical practice has changed since that wording was originally used. I think I know what it was supposed to mean, but I think it's too vague now, and I'm really sorry to be a pain on this, but
just one. If I suggest that as part of your amendment, the authority is delegated to Steve as licensing community safety manager and myself, then we can take that away with the spirit of what you're saying and make we're more than happy to run that by you to make sure that has matched the spirit of what you're.
Yeah, I'm more than happy that I'd be more even happier when it passes relevant legal people, because it's just no, because I think we can all see a scenario where there's a challenge on it. So
yeah. No, absolutely. And you had another thing that you wanted to bring in. Do you want to bring that in one block amendment, Councillor Brown?
Since I proposed, I'll just say I'm really happy to accept that proposal for that amendment. I think it makes absolute sense. GP surgeries now contain a whole range of different practitioners, and I think it's very important we get this right. So very happy with that amendment. So I'm happy to accept it.
Sean, just a nod is fine if you want. Yeah, no, brilliant. Okay, thank you. In which case, and then you have a second part to that. Oh, sorry.
Second one's in case I think of a number. So it was around the MOT's 3 years. I'm just slightly worried because they're now mileage. So it's 2.6.2. And I think, is that right? I've written it down wrong. Lovely, brilliant.
It's 8.13. Oh, sorry, it's in the appendix. Yes, it is. Sorry, on the report, it's
Yeah, I've gone to the
it's-
actual
yeah,
actual
yeah,
document.
no,
Sorry.
Policy, it's 262.
262.
So, I mean, it probably needs to be or on reaching a mileage in excess of X thousand miles. I just haven't decided what X is yet. I mean, whether it be 100,000 or I don't know without knowing what the sort of mileage is. It's just to fill a gap because I'm just slightly worried that you could, in the first 3 years, someone could do well more than 100,000 miles, I suspect, and maybe there should be an MOT. Sorry, I'm being a right pain today, aren't I?
Every time we do checks, we keep them in as well. So it comes and since delegate it to you as again,
It ought to be linked to the
that's not
announced
it. We
Nigel. What is being suggested by Steve is that he can do some analysis to see where they've gone, where they're quite high in those first 3 years, and if we delegate the authority to Steve and myself, and we'll also consult
I
with you to
completely satisfied with that because, as I say, without knowing what's a reasonable number, I'd just be plucking a number from the air, which is not good.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, Ruth, are you happy for that amendment to be incorporated?
Yeah.
And Steve, Sean, sorry. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. In which case, that's absorbed into the substantive. Right. And then I've got Councillor Allen for the next part. Babe.
Thank you. So I'd like to propose an amendment to 3.9.3 and to include any drugs offence that has to be reported within 48 hours.
Yeah. So simply just to include drug offences onto that list.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And Councillor Brown, are you happy to bring that into the substantive?
Yes, and I'm wondering whether we should include the word alcohol in there as well.
Well, my assumption was
Or
that it would
not.
come under motoring offence for that.
Okay.
So what
One
would it
second.
be? Sorry, Ian. Not on-
Councillor Albert.
Yeah, I mean, I was happy to second Amy's amendment, but I was also then going to propose a further thing because in looking at it, sort of just really cross-referencing section B, which is about the impact of offences and convictions, drunkenness specifically is mentioned, and this is not drunk in charge of a vehicle, but drunk and disorderly. And I think you get 2 strikes and you're out, and that's kind of thing. So I think alcohol or drunkenness should be included in there, albeit that it isn't an automatic prohibition. It's a prohibition on alcohol. Don't know. Anyway, but I think something to do with alcohol and drunkenness should be maybe drugs and alcohol or something like that. Yeah.
So any drugs or alcohol offence.
Yeah.
Because it might be both.
Yeah.
Yeah. We just completely go off. Councillor Brown, are you happy to? And sorry, Amy, did you want to?
I was just going to come back that my assumption on the alcohol would have been it would come under any motoring offence, as in a drunk in charge of a vehicle. So that was my assumption. But obviously, yeah, I suppose if you have a mixture of the two, drugs and alcohol, yeah, that works.
Thank you. So Councillor Brown's happy. Sean, are you happy? Excellent. Okay, that's absorbed. Right. Was there another one that I've missed? Yes, of course it was. Councillor Prendergast.
I'll keep it brief. I would like to recommend an amendment to part 3 now becomes part 1, and that the safeguarding element of part 3 is moved to the top of that section, if that makes sense.
So you mean the whole of section 3?
Drivers. It would
Through the
be-
whole- yeah, so
it would seem
this
strange to
becomes
not-
part 1.
It would seem strange to not keep it in with drivers, I think.
May I suggest that it becomes part 2 because part 1 is the
Sorry,
introduction.
Part 2 after the introduction, of course. Well spotted.
It might just be a little bit confusing for people reading.
I knew you'd stop.
Okay. Yeah, so just swap part 2 and part 3. Okay. You are the seconder for the original motion, so I'm just going to go to Ruth. Are you happy for those? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, we'll absorb that into substantive. Now, is there any further debate and or amendments? No, we've really bottomed that one out. Excellent. I just want to say very quickly before we go to the vote, I wanted to thank you, Steve, and the team for the excellent work on not just this one, but the previous one and all the work that you guys are doing. But on this one particularly, I think it's great that the working relationship with taxi drivers is going so positively, and that's continued on. I certainly think that the updates to this policy are a really good balance of the needs of the drivers and the public, and our council's priorities, which is just absolutely fantastic, and is obviously no easy thing when you're balancing all of those. So really, really great work on those.
Thank you. I'll pass that on to the team.
Just because I know how hard that you guys work in that area, and it's not an easy process, because I don't think I've seen a policy that long for a long time. So it's clearly a very robust process. So thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
I'd just like to echo that as well. And Steve, if you get any indication there's going to be another 10-hour hearing, could you book it when I'm on holiday?
Thank you, bro. You've got that on your CV now.
I think it's actually very important that people with experience really. Excellent. Okay, I have no more requests to speak. So please, could we go to the vote?
That motion's carried.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming out this evening, and everyone who's watching from home for a fantastic meeting. Councillor Tyson's watching from home. I'm giving him a little shout out. Thanks, Tom.